Okay, Matthew, you hearing me?
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm gonna try the headset again. I think the audio is a little better on the headset.
Okay.
As long as Zoom stays up. Is it more clear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. Don't need that. All right. In the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, wisdom to know the difference. The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Oop. Okay. All right, let's do this. So we got Jasmine, got it. Callum, okay. Aiden, Matt's there. Emily, I'll start going like this. Emily, yo, how you doing? All right, anyways. Abigail, Ashley, Anna, Donovan, John Hurley, Quattro. Oh, it's Quattro. Okay, gotcha, Quattro. Cameron, close. Rebecca, Koser, John Cost, sorry. Kate, LeComptois, gotcha. Sophia, Maria, gotcha, Maria. Sam, okay. Christina, I called you Catherine, sorry. Kristen. Sarah O'Toole, Tristan, Adronic. Teresa Parrish. Caleb, gotcha, Caleb. Kyle. Jordan, there you are, Jordan. Antonia. Jashawn, okay, Jashawn's usually over there. Jonah. Landon. And we've got Anthony on remote. Okay. Let's see here. So let's do this. So we've got one kind of bond between positively and negatively charged ions, right? That is an ionic bond, okay? Think of that as being like a magnet sticking to a refrigerator, okay? It's literally negatively charged anion, very strong attraction to a positively charged cation. Good example of that. What's a good example of that? Yeah, John. NaCl, okay. So it's literally an electron leaves one atom and goes to another atom. Those are ions. Then we have covalent bonds. Covalent. It's like, get all stylish. Throw my scapular back. Covalent. We are sharing valence electrons, right? We're sharing valence electrons. And so we need to know, looking at the periodic table of the elements, how we can calculate the number of valence electrons that this particular atom has, all right? So they're sharing, we're sharing them. And is a covalent bond, which is stronger? Covalent or ionic? Christina. Covalent is stronger. So, covalent bonds are the strongest bonds. A double covalent bond is stronger than a single covalent bond, and a triple covalent bond, strongest bond. Yo, okay? So, you literally would have to rip the molecule apart. All right? So, and we have two different kinds of covalent bonds. The top variety, called a nonpolar covalent bond, it simply means that electrons are equally shared between the two atoms. So they're sharing these, right? In this case, it's the yellow and the orange one. Those two chloride ions are sharing those electrons. And in this bond, the yellow electron is spending as much time around the left chloride as it is, or chlorine as it is on the right chlorine, okay? The orange is the same. So those are non-polar covalent bonds. And when a molecule is comprised of non-polar covalent bonds, this is going to give that molecule a particular property, which is going to be important when we talk about some of these things a little bit later. So non-polar, they're still sharing equally shared electrons. Now we've got polar covalent bonds. So they're shared, but the electrons are shared, but they're shared unequally. They're shared unequally. So in this molecule here, we can see that what we're seeing is that the yellow electron, which belongs to the hydrogen, is spending more of its time, it's hanging out with chlorine more than it's hanging out with hydrogen. So what that means is that the chlorine typically has for most of the time, has an extra electron orbiting around it. So for most of the time, it sort of has a negative charge, but it's not an ion, okay? It's still chlorine. And because the electron that normally belongs to hydrogen spends most of its time hanging out with chlorine, it has a partially positive charge. So when we think of polar, that's what when you hear the word polar, you should think the separation of charges. There's going to be a positive aspect and a negative aspect to it. When you hear the word polar, you should be thinking that. There's a molecule that's going to have some sort of a positive aspect and a negative aspect. And this also is going to convey to the molecule particular properties. And it's going to affect and impact how it interacts with all the other molecules in a system. Now, what is it that actually determines how much time the electrons would tend to spend around a particular element or atom? That property is called electronegativity, right? You probably read about that. So electronegativity, simply defined as the affinity that an atom has for electrons, right? How strongly does this atom attract electrons? How strongly does this atom attract electrons? And if we look at our little chart here, and we're using these four, well, why do you think we're using these four elements? Oxygen, hydrogen. Yep, Jonah. Okay, so we're going to focus on the four most common biological elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And what do we notice about this chart here? What do we notice about the electronegativity? Their differences. How about let's look at the difference between oxygen and carbon, for example. Is there a difference up there? Sophia, is there a difference up there? What kind of a difference do you see?
Oxygen has more electronegativity than carbon.
Okay, so if you were to have a bond, a covalent bond between, so let's see what difference that might make. So if you had a bond between carbon and oxygen, for example, since oxygen has the higher electronegativity, where might that electron spend more time, with oxygen or with carbon? With oxygen, okay? So you could sort of, I like to think of electronegativity as, maybe if you could break it down into saying it's electron negativity, right? Because if it's going to attract electrons to itself, that is going to then, and what charge do electrons have? Negative charge, right, Kyle? It's Kyle, right? So electrons have negative charge. Right, so that means if we have a bond forming between oxygen and carbon, that oxygen is probably going to be a little bit more negative most of the time than the carbon. Okay. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you right now is that this bond here, one of the most common molecules that we're going to talk about are called bonds is hydrocarbon bonds. Bonds between hydrogens and carbons. Yes, there's a little bit of difference there between carbon and hydrogen, but we're going to say that for the most part, those bonds are nonpolar bonds. So when you see a bond between a carbon and a hydrogen, pretty much assume that that's going to be a nonpolar bond, all right? Okay. So here's a molecule, ethanol. Ethanol, otherwise known as ethyl hydroxide. So we've got here's a methyl group, here's a methyl group, here's our hydroxyl group. So I just want to go through this electronegativity one more time using a bigger model here for us. So I want to focus on this bond right out here. All right, that's what I want to focus on. I know you guys don't have this, but it's going to be posted. You can draw it if you want to. So oxygen has 6 valence electrons, right? We talked about that on Friday. So I'm going to call those all red. And then this black electron, we're going to say belongs to carbon. And then we're going to say this black electron typically belongs to hydrogen. Okay, so these are all covalent bonds, right? Covalent bonds, sharing electrons. Focus on this bond right here. Yo. So, let's say I'm changing it to red. We're going to red. Red alert. We're going to red because I'm going to say, we're going to assume, is it really 80%? I have no idea what it is. I just sort of like, that sounds like a lot of the time, so we're going to say that. So let's just say 80% of the time, this electron that hydrogen's donating, right? Hey, I'm bringing this to the potluck dinner. I'm going to bring my hydrogen, put it on the table. Then oxygen comes up and is like, whoom, whoom, whoom. That was great. Thanks for the taco salad. I didn't get any. Well, that's your problem. Anyways, so let's say that 80% of the time, this electron is not orbiting hydrogen, but it's hanging out in the oxygen neighborhood. It likes hanging out with the oxygen. And as we said, that means that 80% of the time, again, I totally made this number up, so if it's different, you can correct me on Wednesday, that there's an extra electron orbiting oxygen, right? So we could say that 80% of the time, oxygen has a -1 charge. Let's see how you guys do. Nice, good. Hey, there we go. It's a Monday. It's a Monday. So it's not an ion, right? It's not an ion. But 80% of the time, the electron's hanging out here. And we represent that by this Greek letter, delta. And we would then write our little -1, delta -1. So it's not a minus like an ion, but it's a delta. And in math in general, or in physics, when you see that Greek letter delta, that usually tells you that things are changing. So this is going to be in flux, because the electron is going to spend some time with hydrogen, right? It's not always spending its time with oxygen. If it spent all its time with oxygen, it wouldn't be a covalent bond. It would probably be an ionic bond. Good. It certainly wouldn't be a James Bond. Okay, so whatever. Told you it's going to be a long time. All right. Now, what about 80% of the time? That means there's one less electron orbiting the hydrogen. I brought my taco salad. I only got one dish. Oxygen's like, it's your fault. Need to be more aggressive. Anyways, whatever. So that means that there's one less electron orbiting the hydrogen. Hydrogen has a proton. So that means that 80% of the time, the hydrogen has this +1 charge, right? Okay, and we're going to represent that with our delta +1. Are we on the same page here so far? Okay, this is important. This is important. Okay. Remember, I'm only focusing on this bond right here. So now let's bring another molecule into the mix. Yo, water. Love it. H2O. I didn't draw it correctly. It's supposed to be a 108-degree angle between the two hydrogens. You can write that on my evaluation. So anyways, we've got two bonds here with hydrogen. So oxygen is sharing electrons with two hydrogens, and it's going to hog the electrons from both of those hydrogens. So both of these hydrogens now have that delta +1, right? That partial charge. And oxygen now is going to be really, really negative. It's going to be really negative most of the time. So now we put these two molecules, we bring them in, we put them in the same beaker. Bloop, 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 bloop. Do we have the potential for some sort of an interaction here? Do we have the potential for some sort of interaction here? Is that a nodding of the head? Rebecca, you saying yes? No, that wasn't. That's Rebecca. Wait, where's Rebecca? That's Rebecca. And who's to the left, to the right of you? Emily. So, what kind of interaction happens here? What? A hydrogen bond. So this hydrogen here on the ethanol, which has that delta +1 partial charge, we call it a partial charge, it's still positive most of the time. It's going to be attracted to the oxygen, which is negative most of the time. Right? Opposites attract when it comes to polar and ionic things. So we're gonna draw our little hydrogen bond between the hydrogen and this oxygen. And anytime you represent a hydrogen bond, you can do it either using dots, but oftentimes you see them represented by these little vertical lines like this. This is how you'll see a hydrogen bond represented. These are relatively weak bonds, hydrogen bonds. So they're much easier to break than covalent or ionic bonds, but they're still very important. Still very important. We have a lot of molecules in our bodies which are transported by water. Why? Because they're polar and they can dissolve easily in water. Why? Because then the water sort of surrounds the polar ends of the molecule. Okay, so we'll stop there for a second. We got any questions about that? All right. So we've now talked about, oh, do you have a question? What does it repel? Actually, the nonpolars repel the water. No. We're going to talk about that very soon, okay? So, that's a good question. So, strongest bonds, covalent bonds. Second strongest bonds, ionic bonds. Third strongest bonds, hydrogen bonds. Just because they're not covalent or ionic doesn't mean they're not important. These things, hydrogen bonds, they're one of the main bonds that help form the shapes of your proteins. Awesome. These are awesome bonds, so very important. Okay. All right, now let's look at this molecule. Propane. Propane. So methane is 1 carbon, ethane is 2 carbons, propane is 3 carbons, methyl ethyl propyl. You guys probably learned that. Methyl ethyl. You know what I'm saying. So, it's Christina. So this molecule, I have a question up here. Will this molecule easily dissolve in water? Will propane dissolve in water? Is there any place for water to actually form? Well, in order for water to interact or to bind with a molecule, what kind of bond must it be able to form with that molecule? Anna, a hydrogen bond. Well, yes. So in order for water to interact with a molecule, it must be able to form a hydrogen bond with that molecule. And in order for it to form a hydrogen bond with that molecule needs to have a region that is polar. Is there anything here that's polar? No. All of these bonds are nonpolar covalent bonds because the electronegativity between carbon and hydrogen is pretty similar. Okay? Pretty similar. So this table here is going to be very, very important for you. I'm not going to ask you to rank the darn things, but you need to know there's a bond between carbon and hydrogen. That's going to be a nonpolar bond. There's a bond between carbon and nitrogen. That's going to be, that tends to be more on the polar side, but especially between carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and oxygen. Those are always going to be polar covalent bonds. Always, always. Okay, so propane does not dissolve in water because it can't interact with water. So since it doesn't interact well with water, it doesn't have any polar regions. When you see a molecule that's all hydrocarbons, and we're going to see that with biology, just as a warning, like we've all taken some form of a language, maybe? Did everybody take some form of language, right? So we go through and they say, here are the rules about these verbs. And they say, but now let's talk about the exceptions. Okay, so I'm going to tell you if a molecule has all hydrocarbons, that this molecule is what we call hydrophobic. Phobia, fearing, right? If you have a phobia, you have fearing. So maybe somebody in here has a moncophobia after this class. You're going to be having to go through intensive therapy about your fear of strange people wearing black robes. Well, that's okay. If that's what happens, I'm sorry. But so phobia means fear. Hydro is water. So this is a water-fearing molecule. Pushes it away. Okay. But as I said on Friday, these molecules are also extremely important, right? All molecules in a system are pretty much important. They just have different properties. Different molecules act differently, don't they? Yes, they do. Okay. So, now we're going to go do look at some of these structures here. We're going to go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to go through all 7 of these different basic functional groups. This is really basic. You need to be able to identify the functional group and name it. You need to be able to tell me whether or not it's polar or nonpolar. All right. So this is one of those flashcard things, all right? This would be good for flashcard, Quizlet, whatever, okay? This is one of those things you just have to know. So the first group is called a hydroxyl. Easy. It forms a combination of a hydrogen and an oxygen, hydroxyl. And we've already covered this functional group. We've said that this is a polar functional group. So hydroxyl groups are hydrophilic, right? They can interact with water. That's the other thing you need to know. So know the name of the functional group, whether that functional group, the functional group is polar or nonpolar, and whether it then interacts with water. Boom. I'm gonna circle that with a little blue for water. Let's move on. All right. Carbonyl. Carbonyl. That is one carbon with forming a double bond, double covalent bond with an oxygen. Carbonyl. These are found in certain organic molecules, such as aldehydes or ketones. And it's a polar functional group. Am I going to stretch or am I going to kill the computer? Okay, those of you who are watching at home, you may lose service. I may fall off the platform. Yo. Double bond. This region's going to be partially negative, partially positive. Okay. Sweet. It's hydrophilic. It's blue. Okay. People get these two confused all the time. Carbonyl, carboxyl. Carbonyl, carboxyl. I'm telling you that you might get confused, so don't get confused. This is a carbonyl with a hydroxyl group. So the carboxyl is actually a combination of the first two functional groups. And this thing is really hydrophilic. Now, this molecule is actually acetic acid, which is vinegar. What makes it an acid? Why do I say it's an acid? Why is it not a base? That's called the biology musical. We're writing it this semester. Let's work together on that. Yes? Hydrogen. What about the hydrogen? It has to do with protons. What do acids typically do? They do what with their protons? Do they accept or they typically donate? They typically donate. Okay? So this is a carboxyl group. Negative, negative, positive. This is a great group. Lots of interactions here. So this is a polar functional group, very polar functional group. I should put a big polar bear up there. A big polar bear, like, mega polar group, all right? So, you know, polar bears are one of the few animals in the world that without ever eating a human being will track you down and kill you. Did you know that? Without ever eating it. See, typically things like lions and tigers, they won't eat us unless they come across us or they get, wounded. But typically lions and tigers, they're like, human, I don't think so. But once they eat you, we must taste pretty good. Because once they eat us, they want to eat us all the time. But polar bears, they'll just eat you just for the sake of eating you. Anyways, why am I saying that? Because I'm crazy. All right, amino. Amino. This is a biggie here. We're going to talk about a lot about aminos. You're amino sometimes. Main element to look for here, nitrogen. Yo, how you doing? All right, so amino groups contain nitrogen. Amino groups are found in amino acids. This is the amine part. This is a preview. This is the acid part. Hey, we looked at that, right? Carboxyl group, sweet. But we're focusing on the amino group. This tends to be polar. So amino groups are polar. They are also hydrophilic. Okay. Sulfhydryls. We don't worry too much about these. I'm going to ask you to be able to identify this. This is also part of an amino acid. So what do you notice about this amino acid and this amino acid? They're just written differently. They both have the same basic structure. They're just written a little bit differently, all right? That's on purpose, I guess. Sulfhydryl groups, they're more, you'll be more You'll cover more of these in detail, probably in maybe in cell biology, I'm not sure, but there's a covalent bond between a sulfur and a hydrogen. That's easy, sulf-hydryl. These are also polar, and they're hydrophilic. So most of these, you notice they're hydrophilic, right? They interact with water. All right, this one. This one is phosphate. It's actually charged. Dun, 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 dun. It's actually charged. 2 negative charges. And then we have a phosphorus with a double bond with an oxygen. All right, this is a phosphate. It's got 2 negative charges. It's an ionic functional group. And ionic functional groups, man, does salt dissolve in water easily or what? Yeah. So ionic ions and charged molecules, for the most part, very easily dissolve in water. Very hydrophilic. Okay. Sweet. Hydrophilic. And finally, methyl. Methyl is here. This is a methyl. Only of carbon and hydrogens. Most of these bonds are non-polar covalent bonds, the bonds between this carbon and each of these hydrogens, as well as between the 2 carbons. So this is a non-polar functional group. So this functional group is hydrophobic. So it's important to know that the functional group is hydrophobic. I'm not telling you whether or not the whole molecule is hydrophobic or hydrophilic. This molecule here, we've got 2 huge regions that are polar. The carboxyl and the amino. This thing will probably relatively easily dissolve in water, but this functional group, the methyls, when you see methyls or you see a bunch of hydrocarbons together, that region is not going to easily dissolve in water. All right. So for each of these functional groups, be able to know the name, know the actual structure of that functional group, know whether or not the functional group, not the molecule, the functional group is polar or nonpolar, and then whether or not that functional group is hydrophilic or hydrophobic. So if it interacts with water, it's hydrophilic, right? Filio, love. If it's hydrophobic, it does not interact well with water. Okay. Good. Questions? Hydrophobic. All right, I already told you that. Oh, good question, Father Sean. Do I need to be able to draw these? Okay. Here's a good principle for you. If you can't draw it, you don't know it. I'm not going to ask you to draw this. But if you can't draw it, so if I just say to Cameron, draw me methyl, go. I don't know what that looks like. You don't know it. I can pick it out on a page. No. These things, if you can't draw it, you don't know it. Okay? Same thing with processes. When we start talking about molecules coming together, if you can't draw it out and speak it out, it's hard for you to really think about it. All right? So, yeah, if you can't draw it, you don't know it. There you go. All right. Functional groups. So these functional groups These functional groups can also allow for the formation of larger biomolecules, which we call macromolecules, macro meaning large, where we form these larger molecules by joining together smaller molecules. So right here on the left, we have alanine. This is an amino acid. So when you hear amino acids, what's one of the main things that might pop into your mind? Amino acid. Anyone? Bueller? Yeah. It has hydrogen? It has nitrogen. Good. It has nitrogen. All right. John? It's a chain, so it can form chains. Anna. Okay. So amino acids, chains of amino acids form proteins. Okay. Good. All right. So these are all right. These are all right. They have nitrogen. They can form chains. But the particular kind of chain, if you string together a bunch of amino acids, you then can get a functioning protein. Okay. Now, in this structure here, you can have a, be ready, the broadcast may be interrupted. I'm doing acrobatics again. Okay, good. So this beta subunit, we're gonna understand hopefully what that means by the time we get to the end of this section. But one of these structures, this is comprised of either 141 or 146 amino acids that have come together and then take on a particular shape, a particular structure. And one of the themes of this class is the structure and function relationship. So if you change the structure of a molecule, you change its function. So anyways, so one of these will have either 141 or 146 amino acids. This other one, called an alpha subunit, also has a number of amino acids being linked together, taking on a particular shape. And then what we do is your body then combines, takes two betas and two alpha subunits, these protein chains, these amino acid chains, links them together, drum roll, and forms one protein that we call hemoglobin. Anyone ever heard of that one? Hemoglobin. What's the function of hemoglobin? John? Transports oxygen. Sweet. Absolutely. Absolutely. Can transport up to 4 oxygens. Oxygen, why is oxygen important? Your body uses it as part of the process to make what molecule? Anna? It breaks down glucose. So it's going to use oxygen as part of the process that breaks down glucose to generate ATP, which is the energy of our cell. Good, okay. So without this hemoglobin working properly, you don't get oxygen transported to the cells. They can't make ATP. And guess what you do? Die. Well, anyways, that's part of biology too. Okay. So we're going to look at 4 classes of biomolecules. 4 classes. 4 classes. Proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. In turn, we're going to look at these in turn. All right. So Ribeye steak and a baked potato. So where, what kind of macromolecules we got going on here? Yep, John. Okay, so ribeye is going to be a lot of protein. Baked potato is going to be carbs. Is there any other macromolecule up there you might see on the screen? Is it Jasmine? Okay, Jasmine. Yeah, we got some lipids in here, right? This nice marbling. Oh, in an iron skillet? Are you kidding me? All right, so, yes. Why did I do that? Well, because these are just good examples of macromolecules. Proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. These are things that we come into contact all the time. And our most common contact with these macromolecules is actually through our diet. So what we do in our diet is we start with the macromolecules, and by the process of digestion, we break them down into very simple units, which then get absorbed into our bloodstream. Then your body takes those and uses those to build macromolecules. Okay, so we'll do a little bit here. So macromolecule is going to be, we're going to focus on a term that we're going to use the word polymer. A poly. So poly means many, and mer means mer. See, I can't smile. Can I smile? Anyways, so a polymer is a large molecule consisting of many smaller, chemically similar subunits. A lot of these subunits that make a carbohydrate or make a protein or even a triglyceride, they're going to be very similar things that are combined together, brought together. And your book uses the term like a train, you know, like a train. It uses that as an image. Or the train, the whole train is the polymer, right? I see a train. I hear that train coming. Sorry, Johnny Cash, my bad. All right. I know. Stick to teaching. Don't quit your day job, right? That's what you're thinking. That's all right. And then the monomer, these are the units, the single units that are brought together to form the polymer. Well, in our case, the monomer would be a train car. All of these would be individual monomers. Okay? So that's what we're going to be seeing. So steak, in this case, is the polymer, right? The individual amino acid. In the case of a protein, the amino acid is going to be the monomer that's going to be linked together. And the other thing that we know is that this train would not be a train were it not for the fact that there were linkages that hold those cars together. So that's also going to be important as we go forward. So, steak, monomer. So what we're going to do then is we're going to go through each of these macromolecule classes. You should know the name of the polymer. For some of these, you're going to get lots of different kinds of polymers. So be ready for that. All right, be ready for that. The name of the monomer of which the polymer is comprised. Amino acid, alpha glucose, beta glucose, fatty acid, whatever. The type of bond. And I don't mean Dun, dun, dun. I don't mean Bond to James Bond. I certainly also don't mean covalent, hydrogen, or ionic. We're going to see that these bonds have, most of them are covalent bonds. They're going to have a very specific name because the bond itself will have a particular structure. And then some functions served by the polymer. All right, sweet. We made it through. We made it through the rain. So, for Wednesday, we are going to we should finish proteins. So through question 11 on page 3. So read and finish the reading and all of the study guide questions for proteins up through question 11. If you want to be reading ahead and getting ready, we're going to discuss proteins, and we'll probably do a worksheet or two about protein structure. So be aware, I'm going to try to post some things tomorrow and let you know. There might be some worksheets for you to print to bring to class so we can work through them tomorrow or Wednesday. Thank you. Awesome. Again, if I could have a few volunteers for cleaning up. I appreciate it. You guys are awesome.